Nestled in the remote hills of eastern Oregon, concealed beneath generations of official silence, rests a truth so horrifying that local authorities kept it suppressed for more than 100 years. From 1852 to 1888, along a 20-mile stretch of the Oregon Trail, over 800 pioneers disappeared, not due to disease or accidents, but because of something far more sinister. A modest wooden structure known as the Sacred Heart Chapel, which offered salvation to dying travelers, stood as the epicenter of the most methodical mass murder scheme in the history of the American frontier. What started as isolated vanishings grew into a calculated family enterprise, so ruthlessly efficient that it redefined the very nature of evil. The Grayson family didn't merely kill for profit. They refined it into an art. Meticulous records were kept of every life taken, every family shattered, every dream buried in shallow graves. Before we step into the darkness that consumed the Grayson family and their victims, I must ask something of you. This channel isn't meant for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the most unsettling truths buried in America's past. If you're among the few who can withstand these dark revelations, subscribe now and leave a comment telling me which state you're listening from. Your support allows us to uncover the stories others dare not tell. Now, let's travel back to 1852, when the Oregon Trail promised hope but delivered horror. Stretching like a lifeline across the American frontier, the Oregon Trail carried dreams westward through 2,000 miles of unforgiving wilderness. For the thousands of families who sold everything for a new beginning, each mile brought both hope and peril. Disease, starvation, and natural disasters claimed countless lives. But in eastern Oregon's rolling hills, death wore a different face, one that smiled with Christian compassion while calculating the worth of a family's belongings. The year 1852 marked the peak of Oregon Trail migration, with more than 50,000 people making the treacherous journey west. By the time most wagon trains reached Oregon's Blue Mountains, they had already traveled close to 1,800 miles. Families were exhausted, supplies were dwindling, and the weakest often succumbed to trail fever, dysentery, and other ailments that turned dreams of prosperity into desperate fights for survival. It was within this landscape of vulnerability that Father Macabre Grayson founded the Sacred Heart Chapel in 1851. The weathered wooden building perched on a hill overlooking a natural resting point along the trail, a place where weary travelers often paused to rest their oxen and bury their dead. To pioneers passing through, the chapel seemed like divine providence, a beacon of hope in the wild where they could seek spiritual comfort and, if needed, proper Christian burial for loved ones. Father Macabre, a tall, gaunt man in his 40s with penetrating gray eyes and a commanding voice, had arrived in Oregon territory claiming to be a traveling missionary. He spoke with eloquence about his calling to serve the spiritual needs of families heading west, and his knowledge of Scripture felt genuine enough to win over even the most skeptical travelers. Beside him stood his devoted wife, who took the name Sister Constance, a woman whose gentle manner and apparent medical knowledge made her invaluable to families struggling with sickness and death. Brother Ezekiel, Macabre's younger sibling, completed the trio that would become synonymous with both salvation and damnation. While Macabre carried the commanding presence of a natural leader, Ezekiel was the practical one, skilled with his hands, knowledgeable about livestock, and always ready to help families repair wagons or tend to animals. Together, the three crafted an image of Christian charity that drew desperate families like moths to a flame. The chapel itself was modest yet well kept, built from local timber with a small cemetery beside the main building. Inside, rough-hewn pews faced a simple altar adorned with a wooden cross that Macabre claimed to have carved himself. The building's most notable feature was its unusually large basement, which the Graysons explained was necessary for storing supplies to aid destitute travelers. The surrounding community was sparse, just a few scattered homesteads and a small trading post about 15 miles east. This isolation served the Graysons well, meaning fewer witnesses to their activities and less chance of outside interference. Local settlers who'd met the family generally spoke well of them, praising their generosity and Christian devotion. After all, who else would dedicate their lives to ministering to dying strangers in the middle of nowhere? What made the Graysons especially effective was their understanding of the trail's brutal realities. They knew that by the time families reached their location, many would be dealing with serious illness, dwindling supplies, and the psychological exhaustion born from months of hardship. They presented themselves as the solution to these problems, not just spiritual guides, but practical helpers who could offer medical care, supplies, and even temporary shelter for families too weak to continue right away. Denominational differences seldom mattered to desperate families. Whether they were Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, or another Protestant faith, the Graysons adapted their approach accordingly. Macabre was well versed in various Protestant traditions and could quote scripture in whatever style comforted his audience best. This flexibility was crucial on the frontier, where denominational differences often took a backseat to simple survival. The first recorded disappearance happened on September 23, 1852. Though investigators wouldn't piece the timeline together until decades later, the Morrison family, James, his pregnant wife Elizabeth, their 3 young children, and Elizabeth's elderly father, had been traveling with a wagon train that dispersed after reaching Oregon Territory. Like many families, they decided to push on alone toward their final destination, confident they could cover the remaining miles without a larger group's protection. When the Morrisons' wagon suffered a broken axle just 2 miles from the Sacred Heart Chapel, it seemed like divine intervention. James Morrison would later be quoted in territorial records saying the chapel appeared like a gift from the Almighty when he spotted it from the ridge where his wagon had broken down. Brother Ezekiel, who seemed to have an uncanny knack for appearing just when travelers needed help most, arrived at the broken wagon within hours. "Brother," Ezekiel said in the slow, measured cadence that would become his trademark, "the Lord has placed you near our humble chapel for a reason. Sister Constance has delivered many babies, and your Elizabeth looks ready to give birth any day now. Father Morai would consider it an honor to offer sanctuary while you repair your wagon and prepare for the blessed arrival." The Morrisons gratefully accepted, moving into the small cabin beside the chapel that the Graysons kept for such purposes. For 3 days, everything seemed perfectly normal. Sister Constance tended to Elizabeth with gentle care. Brother Ezekiel helped James with wagon repairs, and Father Morai offered spiritual comfort to the anxious family. The children played in the chapel yard while Elizabeth's father, Samuel, rested his arthritic bones in the cabin's rocking chair. On the 4th day, things shifted. Elizabeth's father was the first to fall ill, complaining of severe stomach cramps and nausea. Sister Constance blamed it on trail sickness, a catch-all term for the various ailments that plagued travelers, and began administering what she called blessed remedies, prepared from herbs and other ingredients kept in the chapel's basement. "The Lord provides healing through nature's bounty," she would say while mixing her concoctions. But sometimes the body must purge itself of toxins before healing can begin. Within hours of taking Sister Constance's medicine, Samuel's condition worsened dramatically. His skin took on a grayish pallor, his breathing grew labored, and he suffered violent episodes of vomiting and diarrhea. James Morrison, growing alarmed, asked if they should seek help from the trading post to the east. But Father Morai counseled patience. "Brother James," the preacher said, placing a reassuring hand on the younger man's shoulder, "I've seen this sickness many times on the trail. It must run its course. Moving Samuel now would surely kill him. We must trust in the Lord's timing and Sister Constance's healing gifts." By the 6th day, young Tommy Morrison, age 7, began showing similar symptoms, then his sister Mary, age 5. Sister Constance worked tirelessly, preparing more remedies, administering what she called purifying treatments, and keeping vigil over the increasingly sick family members. To James and Elizabeth, still healthy but exhausted from caring for their loved ones, the woman seemed like a saint sent by God to help them through their trial. The truth was far more sinister. The blessed remedies Sister Constance administered with such apparent devotion contained carefully measured doses of arsenic, which the Graysons had obtained from local mining operations under the pretense of pest control. The symptoms, stomach cramps, nausea, skin discoloration, and eventual organ failure, perfectly mimicked those of various trail diseases, making the murders virtually undetectable to grieving family members who had already witnessed so much death and suffering on their journey west. Samuel Morrison died on the 7th day, followed by Tommy on the 9th and Mary on the 11th. Each death was accompanied by elaborate Christian rituals performed by Father Morai, who spoke movingly about the deceased joining their Heavenly Father and finding peace after earthly suffering. The remaining family members, devastated by grief but grateful for the Grayson's spiritual support, never questioned the rapid succession of deaths. After all, entire families were known to succumb to disease on the trail. What they didn't know was that each night, after the grieving survivors had exhausted themselves with weeping and prayer, Brother Ezekiel would systematically search through the family's possessions, making detailed inventories of everything of value. The Morrisons had been relatively prosperous back in Missouri, and their wagon contained fine furniture, quality tools, family heirlooms, and a substantial amount of gold coins James had sewn into hidden pockets of his clothing. On the 12th day, James Morrison himself began experiencing the telltale symptoms. Elizabeth, now in early labor and terrified she would lose her husband along with her children and father, begged Sister Constance to do everything possible to save him. The woman's response would later be remembered as particularly chilling by those who eventually uncovered the truth. "My dear child," Sister Constance said, holding Elizabeth's trembling hands, "some illnesses are God's way of calling his children home. We must not question his wisdom, only trust in his mercy. Your husband will join your precious babies in paradise, and you will raise your new child knowing your family awaits you in glory. James Morrison died on the 14th day, just hours before Elizabeth gave birth to a son who lived only long enough to be baptized by Father Morai. When Elizabeth herself succumbed to the same mysterious illness 3 days later, the entire Morrison family had been erased in less than 3 weeks. To any outside observer who might have asked about the family's fate, the Graysons had a perfectly reasonable explanation. The Morrisons had arrived sick and exhausted from the trail, had contracted a virulent form of dysentery that sometimes struck entire families, and had died despite the best efforts of Christian caregivers who had risked their own lives to provide comfort in their final hours. Father Morai had given them proper Christian burial in the chapel cemetery, and their possessions had been consecrated to the Lord's work, a pious-sounding euphemism for theft. But the Morrison family's disappearance was only the beginning. The Graysons had discovered something that would transform their lives and terrorize the Oregon Trail for the next 36 years. Murder, when executed with sufficient planning and religious justification, could be extraordinarily profitable. The success of their first family annihilation taught the Graysons valuable lessons that shaped their methodology for decades. They learned that isolated families were easier targets than those in groups, that gradual arsenic poisoning perfectly mimicked common trail ailments, and that their religious authority gave them nearly unlimited credibility with desperate, grieving people who needed someone to blame besides God for their suffering. Most importantly, they discovered the Oregon Trail provided an endless supply of victims who wouldn't be missed for months, if ever. Unlike in settled communities, where disappearances would be quickly noticed and investigated, the trail was full of transient families whose exact whereabouts were unknown to relatives back east. A family vanishing in Oregon might not be expected to contact loved ones for 6 months or more, and even then, the dangers of frontier life offered countless plausible explanations for their silence. In the months following the Morrison murders, the Graysons refined their operation with methodical precision, establishing patterns and procedures that would serve them well over the years. Brother Ezekiel became their scout, riding the trail approaches to identify promising targets, families with obvious wealth, those traveling alone or in small groups, and especially those already dealing with illness or mechanical problems that made them vulnerable to offers of help. Sister Constance developed her poisoning techniques, experimenting with different doses and delivery methods to achieve maximum effectiveness while maintaining plausible deniability. She discovered arsenic could be easily disguised in herbal teas, medicinal tinctures, and even communion wine, making it simple to administer to entire families under the guise of spiritual or medical care. Father Morai, meanwhile, perfected the psychological manipulation that kept victims compliant even as their loved ones died around them. He became expert at reading people's denominational backgrounds and adjusting his theological approach accordingly. For Methodist families, he emphasized divine healing and prayer. For Presbyterians, he focused on predestination and God's ultimate plan. For Baptists, he stressed personal salvation and heavenly reunion. The chapel itself underwent subtle modifications to support their murderous enterprise. The basement was expanded and divided into sections, one for storing victims' possessions, another for preparing arsenic solutions, and a third that served as a temporary morgue where bodies could be kept while the Graysons decided on disposal methods. They also dug a series of unmarked graves in a grove behind the chapel, locations that would eventually hold the remains of hundreds of victims. The winter of 1852-53 gave the Graysons valuable time to plan and prepare for the next year's killing season. They used the months when the trail was largely empty to sort through the Morrisons' possessions, deciding what to keep, sell, or hide. They also made their first contact with black market dealers in larger Oregon settlements, establishing relationships with men who asked no questions about the origins of the goods they purchased. Brother Ezekiel proved particularly adept at this aspect of their operation. His honest face and straightforward manner made him believable when he claimed to be selling possessions on behalf of families who had decided to return east or had died of natural causes. He learned to space out sales across multiple communities and to target different buyers for different categories of goods. Fine furniture and household items went to wealthy settlers, tools and farming equipment to practical farmers, jewelry and precious metals to specialized merchants. By spring 1853, the Graysons had transformed from amateur killers into professional predators with a sophisticated understanding of their craft. They had resolved the practical problems of victim selection, murder methodology, body disposal, and profit realization. More importantly, they had created a public persona that made them virtually above suspicion. The spring of 1853 brought renewed trail traffic and fresh opportunities. Their second major success came in May when they encountered the Hoffman family, German immigrants with limited English traveling with a wagon full of valuable possessions, fine craftsmanship tools, quality textiles, and a substantial amount of gold coins representing their life savings. The Hoffmans were ideal victims in many ways. Their language barrier made them dependent on the Graysons for communication, their foreign customs made them seem exotic and potentially suspicious to other travelers, and their obvious wealth made them attractive targets. Additionally, their limited English meant they were less likely to understand subtle warnings or effectively communicate concerns to others. The family's patriarch, Heinrich Hoffmann, was a skilled clockmaker who had brought his tools and trade goods to establish a business in Oregon. His wife, Greta, was pregnant with their fourth child, and their 3 existing children ranged from 6 to 12 years old. When wagon problems forced them to seek help near the Sacred Heart Chapel, the Graysons saw another opportunity to perfect their deadly craft. This time they experimented with different approaches. Instead of waiting for natural illness, Sister Constance began administering small arsenic doses almost immediately, disguised as preventive medicine to ward off trail diseases. She convinced the family that blessed protection she offered would keep them healthy during their recovery. "My God," Heinrich said in broken English when Sister Constance first offered her medicine, "you are so kind to strangers. God will bless you for helping us." "God has already blessed us," Sister Constance replied with practiced sincerity, "by giving us the opportunity to serve His children in their time of need." The Hoffman family's murder took nearly a month, but the extended timeline allowed the Graysons to thoroughly inventory their possessions and plan how to dispose of the valuable clockmaking tools and trade goods. It also gave them time to study the family's routines and relationships, knowledge valuable for future operations. By the end of 1853, the Graysons had successfully murdered 3 complete families totaling 16 people, and they had begun to see their operation as a business requiring the same careful planning and attention to detail as any profitable enterprise. They started keeping records, not just of victims' possessions, but of their methods, mistakes, and successes. These records, discovered decades later in the chapel's hidden basement compartments, would eventually provide investigators with a horrifying window into the systematic nature of the Graysons' crimes. Written in Father Morai's precise handwriting, the ledgers contained detailed entries for each family murdered, including names, dates, possessions taken, disposal methods, and profits from selling stolen goods. The entries were written in a cold, businesslike style that treated human lives as inventory. A typical entry might read, * Morrison family, 5 souls departed, September-October 1852. Possessions included 2 gold coins, furniture items, quality tools. Bodies interred in Grove Section C, estimated profit, $400. Method, arsenic via medicinal teas. Duration, 17 days. Lessons learned, reduce dose frequency to extend timeline and reduce suspicion. As word of the Graysons' charitable work spread along the trail, they began attracting victims actively seeking their help. Families who had heard about the good Christian folk providing aid would sometimes seek out the Sacred Heart Chapel specifically, walking directly into the trap the Graysons had so carefully constructed. The Graysons' methodical approach to mass murder evolved significantly during their second year. They had learned from early experiences that success required not just effective killing techniques, but sophisticated systems for managing every aspect of their deadly enterprise. Father Morai, with his analytical mind and leadership skills, began treating their operation like a business that happened to involve murder. The summer of 1854 marked a turning point when they encountered the Wetherbe family from Tennessee. Charles Wetherbe was a former Confederate officer who had decided to seek his fortune in Oregon rather than rebuild his war-torn plantation. He traveled with his wife Margaret, their twin daughters Sarah and Susan, aged 15, and Margaret's younger brother David, a skilled blacksmith with his complete set of professional tools. What made the Wetherbe case significant wasn't just their wealth. Charles had converted most of his assets into gold coins and jewelry hidden in a specially constructed wagon compartment, but their intelligence and natural suspicion. Charles had been a military officer, trained to notice details and assess threats. Margaret was educated, well-read on trail dangers, and naturally cautious about trusting strangers. When the Wetherbe wagon developed wool problems near the chapel, Charles initially resisted the Graysons' offers. He had heard stories about travelers accepting help from strangers and never being seen again, and something about the isolated location and the convenient timing of Brother Ezekiel's appearance made him uneasy. "I appreciate your Christian charity," Charles told Father Morai during their first meeting, "but we've got the skills and tools to handle our own repairs. We'll be moving on directly." Father Morai, however, had become expert at reading people and adapting his approach. Rather than pressing, he withdrew gracefully, mentioning casually that Sister Constance had seen signs of sickness in the area, possibly cholera or dysentery, and suggesting the family might want to stay until certain none had been exposed. "Of course, Brother Charles," Morai said with apparent understanding. "A wise man protects his family. But I'd feel remiss in my Christian duty if I didn't mention Sister Constance has been treating several cases of trail fever these past weeks. Symptoms can take time to manifest, and traveling while infected can spread disease and weaken the body's defenses." The mention of disease had exactly the effect Morai intended. Margaret, exhausted from months of trail life and worried about her daughter's health, began reconsidering a quick departure. When young David developed a mild fever the next day, a fever Sister Constance claimed was an early symptom of regional sickness, the family's resistance crumbled. Perhaps, Margaret suggested to her husband, we should accept their offer of shelter just until we're certain David isn't seriously ill. Charles agreed reluctantly, but his military training kept him alert. Unlike previous victims, Charles watched everything with calculating eyes and asked pointed questions about the family's background and the fate of other travelers who had sought their help. The Graysons adapted by providing carefully crafted stories about successfully treating previous families. They showed him the chapel cemetery, pointing out graves they claimed belonged to travelers who had arrived already dying and received proper Christian burial. They even showed him forged testimonial letters, supposedly from grateful families who had recovered and continued safely to their destinations. "Brother Charles," Father Morai said one evening as they sat on the chapel porch, "I understand your caution. A man who has served his country learns to trust carefully. But consider this, if we meant you harm, would we not have acted by now? Would we not choose easier targets than a trained soldier with weapons and watchful eyes?" The psychological manipulation was subtle but effective. By acknowledging Charles's suspicions and military background, Morai made him feel respected and intelligent. By pointing out he would be a difficult target, the preacher made the idea of being targeted seem less likely. Most importantly, by demonstrating apparent openness and honesty, he gradually lowered Charles's defenses. The actual murders of the Weathered family took nearly 6 weeks, the longest timeline the Graysons had yet attempted. Sister Constance began with extremely small arsenic doses administered through water she claimed had been blessed for healing and recommended for preventing disease spread. The doses were so small symptoms developed gradually, appearing to be natural illness. David, the youngest and weakest, succumbed first. His death seemed to confirm Sister Constance's warnings about regional sickness, and the family's gratitude for her care during his final days made them even more trusting. Margaret was next, developing symptoms Sister Constance attributed to the strain of nursing David. Charles, trained to analyze battlefield situations, began noticing disturbing patterns, that he and his daughters remained healthy while others grew sick, the peculiar nature of symptoms, the Graysons' consistent presence during the worst moments of each illness. His suspicions reached a crisis when he discovered Brother Ezekiel examining his wagon contents late one night. When confronted, Ezekiel claimed he was checking to ensure possessions were secure and wild animals hadn't gotten into supplies. The explanation was plausible, but Charles's instincts told him otherwise. "Margaret," he told his dying wife the next morning, "I think we need to leave this place. Something isn't right here." But Margaret was too weak to travel, and moving her would likely have killed her. Charles found himself trapped between growing suspicions and love for his family. He couldn't abandon his dying wife, but he also couldn't shake the feeling staying would doom them all. The resolution came when Charles discovered a hidden basement compartment containing possessions clearly belonging to other travelers, items too personal and valuable to have been willingly abandoned. Among them were a child's doll showing signs of recent ownership, a pocket watch engraved with an unfamiliar name, and most damning, a recently dated letter addressed to someone in Oregon City that had obviously never been sent. The letter, in a woman's handwriting, described arriving safely at a chapel and thanking God for the kindness of the Christian family caring for her sick children. Charles realized he had found evidence of previous murders and that his family was being systematically poisoned by the very people claiming to save them. But his realization came too late. Margaret died that night, and he awoke the next morning feeling the familiar symptoms that had preceded each family member's death. What Charles didn't know was the Graysons had been watching him, noticed his growing suspicions, and decided to accelerate his poisoning before he could act. Father Morai had slipped a massive arsenic dose into Charles's evening meal, ensuring the former soldier would be too weak to pose a threat. As Charles lay dying with his twin daughters at his bedside, he made a desperate attempt to warn them about the Graysons' true nature. But his words were dismissed as fevered ramblings, and the girls continued trusting the people slowly murdering them. The Weathered case taught the Graysons important lessons, that intelligent, suspicious victims required more sophisticated manipulation, that extending the murder timeline, while riskier, made crimes more believable and profitable, that they needed better methods for detecting and managing suspicious victims, and most importantly, that even trained, intelligent people could be successfully deceived and murdered with sufficient patience and skill. This gave them confidence to target increasingly wealthy and prominent families. The discovery of evidence from previous murders also led to improved evidence disposal. They began burning personal items that could identify victims, melting down jewelry and precious metals to eliminate marks, and creating more sophisticated hiding places for possessions they intended to keep or sell later. By the end of 1854, the Graysons had murdered 23 people in 7 families, and their operation had become a sophisticated criminal enterprise generating substantial profits while maintaining complete secrecy. They had also begun seeing themselves not as criminals, but as instruments of divine will, rewarded for their service by prospering from victims' possessions. The year 1855 marked a crucial turning point when they encountered their first major challenge, the survival of an intended victim who had witnessed enough to expose their entire operation. The incident began routinely with the arrival of the Patterson family from Ohio but ended with the Graysons facing terrifying possibility of discovery and desperate choices about their future. Thomas Patterson was a successful merchant who had liquidated his Ohio business to pursue opportunities in Oregon's growing economy. He traveled with his wife Emily, their 4 children, aged 8 to 16, and Emily's sister Catherine, an unmarried woman in her 30s who served as teacher and caregiver. What made the Pattersons particularly attractive wasn't just their obvious wealth. Thomas had converted assets into easily transportable gold and banknotes, but their respectability and the likelihood their disappearance would eventually be noticed by business associates in Ohio and Oregon. The family's wagon train had dispersed near the Blue Mountains, and they were traveling alone when they encountered Brother Ezekiel about 5 miles from the Sacred Heart Chapel. Their wagon hadn't broken down, and no one was obviously ill. But Ezekiel had learned to create opportunities rather than wait for them. "Good afternoon, brother," Ezekiel called as he approached. "I couldn't help but notice your fine oxen. That's quality livestock. You folks wouldn't be interested in trading for fresh supplies, would you? We keep a good stock at the chapel ahead." Thomas, a shrewd businessman, evaluated offers carefully. He was interested in fresh supplies, but something about Ezekiel's manner, too friendly, too eager, made him cautious. "We appreciate the offer," Thomas replied, "but we're well supplied for the rest of our journey. We'll be moving on directly." Ezekiel, however, was prepared. "Of course. But I wonder if I might mention something that could save your family considerable trouble. Sister Constance, that's our medical woman, has been treating several cases of mountain fever recently. Nasty business that takes hold gradually, and by the time folks realize they're sick, they're too weak to travel safely." The mention of disease affected Emily, who immediately worried about her children's health. "Mountain fever?" she asked. "We haven't heard about disease here." "Well, ma'am," Ezekiel said with practiced concern, "it's not something folks like to talk about. Bad for business. But Sister Constance has remedies that can prevent it if administered before symptoms appear. Might be worth stopping by to have your family examined." Thomas remained skeptical, but Emily's maternal instincts were activated. The idea her children might be exposed to a dangerous disease unknowingly was terrifying, and prevention seemed too valuable to ignore. "Thomas," she said quietly, "perhaps we should at least speak with this medical woman. If there's disease here, shouldn't we take precautions?" Reluctantly, Thomas agreed to visit the chapel, telling himself they'd get information about the supposed disease and continue. He had no way of knowing this decision would lead to the most harrowing experience of his life and the near destruction of his family. The Graysons received the Pattersons with their usual Christian warmth and subtle manipulation. Father Morai impressed Thomas with business knowledge and apparent familiarity with Oregon commercial conditions. Sister Constance charmed Emily with her gentle manner and obvious affection for children. Brother Ezekiel entertained the children with frontier stories and demonstrations of practical skills. Within hours, the family agreed to spend the night to let Sister Constance examine everyone for mountain fever signs. The examination predictably revealed several family members showed early symptoms requiring immediate treatment with Sister Constance's preventive remedies. Catherine Patterson, Emily's sister, was first to receive treatment. As an unmarried woman devoted to caring for her sister's family, she was particularly concerned about the children's health and eagerly accepted Sister Constance's medicine, encouraging others to do the same. But Catherine was also the most observant, with a naturally analytical mind that noticed details others missed. On the second night, she observed Brother Ezekiel making what appeared to be a careful inventory of their wagon contents. When she mentioned this to Sister Constance, the older woman dismissed it as routine concern for security. "Brother Ezekiel checks all our guests' possessions," Sister Constance explained. "We've had theft problems, and we want to ensure nothing goes missing while families are under our care." The explanation seemed reasonable, but Catherine continued noticing troubling details: how Father Morai's eyes lingered on Thomas's gold watch, how Sister Constance always prepared medicines in private, the peculiar coincidence that every family member who received treatment seemed to develop symptoms requiring additional treatment. Catherine's suspicions reached a critical point on the 4th day when she discovered Sister Constance adding a white powder to medicine intended for young Timothy Patterson, the family's youngest child. When Catherine asked about the powder, Sister Constance claimed it was blessed salt enhancing healing properties. But Catherine, whose father had been an Ohio pharmacist, recognized the crystalline appearance as inconsistent with ordinary salt. More importantly, she noticed Sister Constance became nervous and defensive when questioned, quite different from her usual serene confidence. That evening, Catherine made a decision that would save her life and her surviving family members' lives. Instead of taking her prescribed medicine, she pretended to drink it while actually spitting it into a handkerchief. She also convinced young Timothy to do the same, telling him it was a game. The results were dramatic and terrifying. While Thomas, Emily, and the 3 older children weakened from treatments, Catherine and Timothy remained healthy. More importantly, Catherine noticed the sickest were those most compliant with Sister Constance's regimen. By the 6th day, 2 Patterson children had died, and Thomas was clearly dying. Emily, though weak, was still conscious and alert enough for conversation. It was then Catherine decided to share her suspicions. "Emily," she whispered, "I think these people are poisoning us. I think they're killing our family." Emily's initial reaction was disbelief and anger. The idea the kind Christian family caring for them could be murderers seemed impossible. But as Catherine explained her observations and the symptom pattern, Emily began seeing the horrible truth. "What can we do?" Emily asked. "Thomas is dying. The children are dying. We're too weak to travel." Catherine had been preparing. "We have to get away, even if it kills us. Staying will definitely kill us. And we have to take Timothy. He's the only other one who hasn't been taking the medicine." The escape plan Catherine devised was desperate and dangerous, but their only chance. She waited until early morning when the Graysons were asleep, then helped Emily and Timothy slip out. Thomas was too weak to move, and the older children were unconscious, but Catherine made the agonizing decision to leave them rather than risk those who might still be saved. The 3 survivors made their way to the family wagon where Catherine had hidden some gold and essential supplies. But as they prepared to leave, they heard footsteps from the chapel. Father Morai, apparently alerted, was coming to investigate. "Quick," Catherine whispered. "Hide in the wagon bed under the canvas. Don't make a sound no matter what." Father Morai found Catherine beside the wagon, and his reaction confirmed her worst fears. Instead of concern for a family member sleepwalking or confused by illness, his expression was cold and calculating. "Sister Catherine," he said quietly. "You should be resting. Mountain fever can cause confusion and poor judgment." "I couldn't sleep," Catherine replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was worried about Thomas and the children." Morai studied her a long moment, evaluating whether she had discovered their secret. Tension stretched between them like a taut wire. "Perhaps," Morai said finally, "Sister Constance should prepare a stronger remedy for you, something to help you rest more peacefully." Catherine understood he was proposing to kill her immediately rather than wait for gradual poisoning. "That's very thoughtful," she said, "but I think I'll try to sleep naturally first." "I'm afraid I must insist," Morai replied, his hand moving to something concealed beneath his coat. What happened next would haunt Catherine for life. As Morai stepped toward her, apparently intending to force her back, Emily emerged from behind the wagon. Despite weakness from poison, she had armed herself with Thomas's pistol. "Step away from my sister," Emily said, her voice weak but determined. Morai turned toward this new threat. In that distraction, Catherine grabbed a heavy iron tool from the wagon and struck his head. The blow wasn't fatal but stunned him long enough for the 2 women and child to begin desperate escape. The wagon pulled away just as Brother Ezekiel emerged, alerted by commotion. The last thing Catherine saw fleeing was Ezekiel running toward the cabin where the rest of their family lay dying, probably to finish what poison had started. The escape journey was a nightmare of fear, exhaustion, and grief. Emily, weakened by weeks of poisoning, could barely stay conscious, leaving Catherine to drive while caring for Timothy and watching for pursuit. They had no clear destination, only desperate knowledge they had to reach help before the Graysons caught them or poison claimed Emily's life. For 3 days, they traveled through unfamiliar territory, following old hunting trails and hoping to encounter other travelers or settlements. Timothy, traumatized by family loss and terrifying escape, barely spoke. Emily drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for dead children and husband. On the 4th day, they encountered a military patrol from Fort Dallas investigating reports of Indian activity. Catherine's story of murder and poisoning at the Sacred Heart Chapel was so extraordinary the patrol leader initially assumed she was delirious from illness or trauma. But Catherine had brought evidence, a vial of Sister Constance's medicine, samples of white powder, and items from their wagon she had seen Brother Ezekiel examining suspiciously. Most importantly, she had Emily as a witness, and although barely coherent, Emily's symptoms were consistent with arsenic poisoning. The military investigation that followed would expose the Graysons' crime's true scope but also reveal the three had escaped just in time. When soldiers arrived at the Sacred Heart Chapel, they found Thomas Patterson and his 3 older children dead, bodies showing clear arsenic poisoning signs. The Graysons had vanished, taking most stolen possessions hidden in the basement. Discovery of basement storage areas gave investigators first glimpse into the systematic nature of the Graysons' murders. Hidden compartments contained possessions from dozens of families, carefully sorted and catalogued. Most shocking were detailed records Father Morai had kept, documenting each murder with cold business ledger precision. The records revealed the Pattersons had been the Graysons' 37th intended victim group and that in less than 3 years, they had murdered over 150 people. Entries described not just murders, but profits from selling stolen goods and lessons learned from each operation. Catherine Patterson's survival and testimony marked the beginning of the end for the Grayson enterprise, but it would take years for authorities to fully understand their crimes and track them down. Meanwhile, knowledge that such evil could hide behind Christian charity sent shockwaves through trail communities, fundamentally changing how travelers approach strangers offering help. The psychological impact on the 3 survivors was devastating and permanent. Emily never fully recovered from arsenic poisoning and died within a year, her body too damaged by toxic treatments. Timothy grew to adulthood bearing childhood trauma scars, never able to trust religious authorities, plagued by nightmares about the chapel and family deaths. Catherine became obsessed with exposing the Graysons and ensuring justice. She testified to military investigators, territorial authorities, and federal marshals, becoming the primary witness whose survival made prosecution possible. Her detailed recollections of methodology and secret records proved crucial understanding their criminal enterprise's full extent. But the Graysons hadn't been idle during escape. With years of experience covering tracks and substantial financial resources from victims, they had prepared for discovery and developed contingency plans to continue operations elsewhere. The manhunt began in earnest fall 1855, but the fugitives had crucial advantages allowing evasion nearly 2 years, detailed knowledge of Oregon Territory remote areas, substantial financial resources, and ability to create new identities and establish themselves where past was unknown. Federal Marshal William Harris, assigned to lead investigation, faced unprecedented challenges. The Graysons weren't ordinary criminals who committed a single crime and fled, they were organized killers who had operated successfully years by exploiting victim trust and vulnerability. Their religious facade had been so convincing many refused to believe them capable of murder. "These aren't desperate men who killed in passion," Marshal Harris wrote. "These are calculating predators who turned murder into business. They understand how to manipulate faith and charity for evil, and have resources and intelligence to reinvent themselves whenever necessary." The breakthrough came spring 1857 when California authorities reported suspicious activities at a remote mission station near the Oregon-California border. The mission of Divine Mercy had appeared suddenly in a location accessing multiple wagon train routes, and travelers stopping for help were reportedly disappearing mysteriously. The mission was operated by a man calling himself Father Benedict Morrison and 2 assistants, Sister Mary Morrison.